Welcome to another Treehouse screencast. The purpose of this screencast is to talk more about the American Revolution. In this segment of the podcast, we will discuss the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Declaration of Independence, the Battle of Trenton, and the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Bunker Hill was fought in mid-June of 1775 near Boston, so we're talking about 4 months or so after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Here's a map of the town of Boston. You can see Boston at the bottom. Now Boston would continue down to its neck. Remember, it had that skinny part that connected to the mainland. And you see the Charles River. That's where the Redcoats crossed to go over to fight the battles of Lexington and Concord. And right across the Charles River, you see Charlestown. Now, Charlestown at this point is just a suburb. It's a part of the city of Boston. But at the time, it was a completely separate town because it was on the other side of Boston Harbor and the Charles River. Just north of Charlestown, you'll see Breed's Hill, and at the very top of the map, you'll see Bunker Hill. So all of these patriots started to gather after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and they realized, hey, we might have a shot at beating the British here. We did okay in that first battle. So they all kind of gathered around, and they decided that they were going to build a fort. Now, this fort was not the kind of fort like the Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine. It wasn't anything that elaborate. It was something that they built just out of dirt and earth, and they just packed it all together, and they built it overnight. They built it on the night of June 16th. Now, they decided once they actually got there that Breed's Hill would be a better place to build the fort than Bunker Hill because Breed's Hill was closer to Boston. You can see that in the map, that Breed's Hill is closer. So they built this, what they call earthenwork fort, because it was just made out of dirt and earth and stacked up. Really last minute, but it would stop a bullet. They built this fort at the top of Breed's Hill, and on the morning of June 17th, the Redcoats woke up and they find this fort up on the hill. So of course they go to attack it. Now, what you have to understand about how the British operated, the British Army operated, is that they would march in these straight lines like this. This is what was known as a gentleman's battle. When they would fight France or they would fight Austria or any of the other European armies, this is how everybody would line up. They would all line up like this together and they would point at each other and shoot. And whoever had the most men basically was going to win. So they lined up like this and marched up the hill. Well, of course, the Minutemen, the Patriots that were inside the fort, weren't worried about lining up like this. They just sat behind the walls of the fort and shot down at the Redcoats. Now, they didn't have a whole lot of ammunition, so William Prescott, who was one of the Patriot leaders, told the men, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. What they're really saying is don't fire till they're so close you know you're going to hit them. Because if you can see the whites of someone's eyes, they're really close to you. Now, it's kind of a scary thing to let an army this big get that close before you start firing on them, because of course, if you can see the whites of their eyes, they're close enough to see you. But remember, they had that earth between them. And so the Patriots were kind of around the edges and looking through little holes and slits that they had left open for themselves. And so it was hard to hit them. But as the British got close enough, they started firing on them. Now, the first round, the first wave of British soldiers, lots of them were killed because they were so close to all of that gunfire, and they were pushed back down the hill. So just a few minutes later, the British regroup, they get in their lines, they march up the hill again. The Patriots do the same thing. They wait until they can see the whites of their eyes, they shoot at them, and then the British have to retreat. The third time up the hill, the Patriots run out of gunpowder. Well, without gunpowder, you can't shoot your guns. And so basically their ammunition became useless because gunpowder was half of the ammunition. So at that point, the British overrun the fort because, of course, they at this point still have weapons and still have ammunition. And they take the fort, and some of the Patriots are killed in the battle. Others flee. And basically, the British win the Battle of Bunker Hill. This gives you another sense of it. You could see the Patriots sort of in their little earthenwork fort at the top of the hill and the British coming up in lines. Now, it wasn't anywhere near this smooth. This is just a rendering to kind of show you how it might look. The hill would have been much rockier. There's probably more trees. There would have been other stuff in the way. And over here on the left, you can see the town of Charlestown. So essentially, the British win this battle. The reason why it is remembered is because if the Americans had not run out of ammunition, they really probably would have won this battle. And they showed, hey, we really can beat the British. We have a shot to actually beat the Redcoats. So that gave other Minutemen and other colonies a chance to see that, yeah, our tactics might actually work, because the British are going to line up in these lines and they're wearing bright red. It looks like a target almost, right? So this was an important battle because it raised the morale of the Minutemen and the militia. Remember, militia is small army for the colonies. So that's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now let's talk for a few minutes about the Declaration of Independence. This is the first time that this has been dealt with. We've already had 2 battles, but we haven't actually declared our independence. And I want to make sure I clarify this. The Declaration of Independence does not end the Revolutionary War. Instead, it's actually the official beginning of the Revolutionary War. Up until this point, the colonists, the militiamen, the Minutemen, they were all just sort of fighting to get King George to pay attention to them. But the Declaration of Independence changes all that. So, remember, at this point in 1775, the colonists all consider themselves British citizens. They consider King George their king. They consider the British Parliament their parliament. They are part of the British Empire. Now, they do know that King George is not paying attention to them, and so they meet. And they've had already one Continental Congress. This is going to be their second Continental Congress, and it convenes in May of 1775. Now, Continental Congress. Congress means a group that meets, and continental because they are on the continent. Remember, Britain is an island, and this is the Americas are a continent. So this is the second time this group has met, so it's called the Second Continental Congress, and they meet in May 1775, and they draft what's known as the Olive Branch Petition. This is an olive branch. Now, an olive branch has been a universal symbol of peace for thousands of years. So this olive branch petition was really something that they drafted to send to King George and to Parliament and say, hey, let's have peace. We want to get along. We don't want all this fighting. King George basically sends back the message, we'll crush you. Those aren't his exact words, but that's essentially what he meant. We don't care about your peace. Now you've ticked us off and we're going to come over and we're going to win. So at that point, the Continental Congress, here they are, they ask Thomas Jefferson and another group of people, small group of people, including John Adams, to write the Declaration of Independence. Here's Thomas Jefferson again. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was not in the military. He was not a military man. He was a very, what they called at the time, enlightened thinker, meaning that he was really, really smart. He was very well read. He understood government. He understood philosophy and all of these really big ideas that they wanted to get across. So they asked him to write the Declaration of Independence because they thought he would be able to do a really good job with it, which I think he did. Here's a digital copy, obviously, of the original Declaration. You can see it was handwritten in a very fancy cursive font, and you see all the signatures at the bottom. So this declaration is Thomas Jefferson, and then after this point, the United States of America, saying we are no longer part of Great Britain. That's what this is about. It's saying that we are going to be our own country. Of course, you can't do that without being ready to fight for it, because of course Britain is going to fight to keep you. They knew that. They were prepared for war. They were prepared for whatever came their way, because these guys who signed this document essentially committed treason against Great Britain. So if the colonists had lost, the king would have asked for these men to be arrested, and they probably would have been put to death. So this was a big deal to put your name on this document and say, we are no longer going to be part of Great Britain. They really had to believe in what they were saying. So Thomas Jefferson wrote this document. One of the most famous passages at the very beginning is when he's talking about how the Americans, how the colonists feel about the rights of man. And here are those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What this means, we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning that these truths speak for themselves. They're so obvious anybody would know them. And those are that all men are created equal. Now, this is a little weird because, of course, most of these men owned slaves at the time. So there's a little bit of a problem with that, but the idea is still there, and we still hold these truths at this point, 230 years later, that we still believe this, that all men are created equal. And now we actually have more equality than we did when they actually wrote them. That they are endowed by their Creator, which means that they are given by their Creator, whether you think that's God or something else, that every man is given and every woman is given by their Creator certain unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away. And three of these are the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to freedom, and the right to pursue happiness, to do what you would like to do with your life. And then after this, Jefferson lists 27 ways that the King of England and Parliament has set about not holding up his end of the bargain for these rights to be carried out for the colonists. So remember that the next time your teacher is asking you to give 3 reasons to back up your main idea, Thomas Jefferson gave 27 reasons why the United States of America should no longer be part of Great Britain. So there's the Declaration of Independence. This is the official beginning of the Revolutionary War. After this is signed, we are moving from fighting to get the king's attention and get him to give us our rights, to now we're saying we're fighting to be a different country. So that shifts the focus of the fighting at that point. That's the Declaration of Independence. And it was signed, as you can see at the top, on July 4th, 1776. So the last battle that we're going to talk about in this section of the podcast is the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga happened in New York, and so you can see here, this is a bigger map. You see New York State right there, and the Battle of Saratoga happened, kind of in the northern part of New York. The Battle of Saratoga was between, obviously, the British and the Americans. The British general was John Burgoyne. We talked about him before. He was a very successful British general throughout most of the war and most of his career. The American general was Benedict Arnold. Now, as we talked about before, later on, Benedict Arnold does become a loyalist. He changes sides halfway through the war, but at this point, he's still a patriot, and he is the general in charge of the American forces. So this was a long, drawn-out battle, and there's a lot of different things that happened in order for it to come out the way it did. But in the end, General Benedict Arnold and his men were able to push the British back, and 5,000 of Burgoyne's men surrendered to the Americans. And so here's a painting that somebody did many years later, kind of showing the surrender at the battlefield. And it looks like George Washington in the middle, even though he was not the general at the time. So why is the Battle of Saratoga important? Well, the Battle of Saratoga is important because this was the battle that really got the attention of the European countries. It happened in June of 1777, and at that point, Benjamin Franklin, who you may recognize his name, was in France. He was in Paris. Actually, he was in Versailles, which is right outside of Paris, trying to get the French to help. One of the Frenchmen who has already been helping is the Marquis de Lafayette. You see him there on the left. On the right, you see King Louis XVI of France. Now, King Louis, of course, is a king. He was an absolute monarch, meaning he had absolute power in France. He did not even have to deal with the parliament like King George in England did. So he wasn't so much interested in the American Revolution in the sense of the Americans fighting for freedom. He just really hated England and King George. So at this point, when the Americans have won the Battle of Saratoga and beaten Burgoyne and had 5,000 British troops surrender to them, France really starts to think these Americans might actually have a shot at this. So we're going to start giving them some support. So the Battle of Saratoga is known as the turning point in the American Revolution because it is after this battle that France officially starts giving support to the Americans, including selling them ammunition, selling them gunpowder, sending their navy, and some other things like that. Shortly after France joined, eventually Spain joins, the Netherlands, and Russia all joined to help the Americans fight the British because the British had made a lot of enemies in Europe throughout the years. So this is why the Battle of Saratoga is important, because it's the battle that convinced the French and then eventually the other Europeans that the Americans could possibly actually win this thing and that they should actually support them.